Hello, and welcome to today's Beyond the Sea webinar. I want to thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Disrupting Diversity Narratives, Introducing Critical Conversations in Libraries. I'm Tony Gwen, Technology and Communications Coordinator for the NNLM Southeastern Atlantic region. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have a few housekeeping items. At the moment, you should see a few questions on the screen. I hope you've had some time to think about these questions. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box. When sharing your thoughts, please be sure to select all participants before you send your comments. Additionally, if your library does have a diversity plan, please feel free to share a link to that plan for the audience. I'll try and save anything shared and send it to all the participants later on. So let's go on to the next slide here. As a reminder, if you need closed captioning for today's webinar, I've shared a link on this page. I'll also share it in the chat box as well. So if you do need closed captioning, be sure to click on that link to access that. For today's presentation, please use the chat box to ask your questions as well. Be sure to send them to all participants. At the end of the presentation, I'll read the questions asked by you for our presenter to answer. Today we have Ione Damasco. She is an associate professor and the coordinator of cataloging at the University of Dayton. Her primary work involves cataloging, collection development, and liaison work for several subject areas. She serves on several teams and committees throughout the libraries and on campus. Through her work on the University Library's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, she has been able to make connections across campus with partners to develop and implement programming that fosters a more inclusive campus environment. Everyone, please welcome Ione.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much for having me present this webinar today. I'm so glad you could all join me. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So good afternoon. As Tony said, my name is Ione Damasco. And today, my hope is that you actually leave this webinar with more questions than answers, but that those questions motivate you to work for deep, lasting, and positive change around diversity and race issues in our libraries. I'm going to start by sharing the results of a research project I completed in early 2016 that has relevance for our discussion around diversity, and then we'll explore what's missing from our conversations on diversity in libraries. So while my experience and research is grounded specifically in academic libraries, I would like you to consider how to map these ideas to your work in health librarianship, because I think there are lots of possible points of connection here. So let's look at how we talk about diversity in libraries. I want to start off by saying that MLA has already started conversations to explore what diversity and inclusion really means for the organization and its members, and how diversity and inclusion impact the people that the members of MLA serve. I want to point out that the word diversity, and some of you have shared your thoughts as to what you think diversity, how it's defined. At its most basic, it does mean variety or difference, and it's often paired with the word inclusion to make clear the importance of making sure people who are different are actually being included within a larger group or structure. So I like to think of diversity as the who or what, and inclusion as the how. And I would also like to introduce the word equity into this conversation as well, which I think of as fairness or justice and should be seen as the outcome of inclusion. But I encourage you to read these two blog posts that I have linked here from MLA when you get a chance to find out more about what's currently underway at MLA around these concepts. So one way that we can examine how we talk about diversity in academic libraries is to look at formal institutional plans or policies regarding diversity. Many colleges and universities have institutional level diversity plans in place. So why is formal planning for diversity important? It's one way of ensuring that diversity is an integral part of the framework of an organization, and plans can provide a blueprint for developing policies, programs, and practices that are seamlessly integrated into the daily operations of an institution. The process of diversity planning can be very similar to strategic planning, and many libraries do strategic planning to set both short-term and long-term goals, to clearly define their areas of work and to demonstrate the value of the library to the wider campus community. Sometimes academic libraries integrate goals related to diversity into their broad strategic plans, but some libraries create separate diversity plans that are more detailed and more focused around diversity goals. And so these are just some resources around diversity plans that I've listed. The ALA has provided these resources and examples, but they've also provided access to their own internal diversity plan. And the Association of Research Libraries has compiled examples of diversity plans and programs in their spec kits. There was one published in 2010, Spec Kit 319, and they have a brand new one that just came out at the end of last year, Spec Kit 356, that I recommend taking a look at. But diversity plans, they can be very variable in terms of their structure and content. So one resource that I wanted to explore more fully around diversity plans for this research project is the Association of College and Research Libraries Diversity Standards and how they might impact diversity planning. So those of you who work in academic library environments, you might be familiar with this. In 2012, ACRL published a set of standards for cultural competence in academic libraries. By creating these standards, ACRL was basically saying that in order to serve our diverse constituents effectively, those of us who work in academic libraries must develop the skills necessary to do so. Being culturally competent is not just a matter of personality or some kind of intuitiveness. There are specific areas of performance that can be developed both on an individual and an organizational level that must be addressed in order to create inclusive environments that serve the needs of all of our users, particularly those users who have been traditionally underserved or underrepresented. So what you see here are the standards listed in brief. There are 11, but the full document goes into much more detail about what each standard means and how it can be implemented. So knowing that there are diversity plans for academic libraries out there, and knowing that these standards exist, I undertook a research project in late 2015 that asked the question, to what extent are these standards actually reflected in current academic library diversity plans? So the process for my research project was pretty straightforward. I defined a sample of academic libraries. I obtained copies of library diversity plans from those libraries if available, and then analyzed those plans using content analysis as the method for determining what standards were present, at least conceptually, in those plans. In this case, I used a deductive approach and used the standards as the existing framework that I wanted to test through a process known as coding, for any of you who are familiar with that kind of qualitative analysis. I used the definitions for each standard as a starting point, and then created a code book that I would use to help me analyze each document. So I read each plan closely and then identified phrases or sentences that corresponded to one of the ACRL standards. So normally when you do this kind of research methodology or analysis, you usually have to have more than one coder to ensure validity and reliability. But I was the only person that was working on this project. So what I did was I coded everything once, I allowed some time to pass, and then I went back and recoded everything to make sure I was looking at things consistently throughout the process. Another limitation of my study is that I decided up front to limit my pool of documents to standalone diversity plans, not strategic plans that included some component related to diversity. And I did not look at higher level, institutional level diversity plans. So I didn't look at a university's overall diversity plan. I was looking specifically for the library's plan. And another challenge I faced when I started this project is I had no idea what the size of the actual pool of documents would be. So I had to sort of come up with an arbitrary plan for sampling, which was kind of interesting. So since I didn't know how many plans existed when I started, I cast a really wide net to see what I could gather. And I used the Carnegie classification database of schools to come up with a pool of 4-year colleges and universities in the United States. I excluded private for-profit schools like the University of Phoenix, DeVry, those kinds of schools. I didn't include schools that were not part of the contiguous 50 states in the District of Columbia, so schools that were in Puerto Rico or Guam, and schools that were closed but still listed in the Carnegie database, I excluded those as well. So my final pool was 1,561 schools. And I tried to search each school's library website to start off with to see if I could find a publicly posted copy of a diversity plan. But I also ended up emailing each library individually, usually the library dean or director, to see if I could obtain a copy of their library's diversity plan if it wasn't posted publicly. I also limited my search to the main undergraduate library for each college or university and didn't include special subject libraries if there were separate plans for those. So in my final analysis, I ended up getting 22 diversity plans from 22 different schools, which is not very many, as you can see from this chart. 326 of the schools that I emailed replied to my email request to let me know that they did not have a formal diversity plan in place. And the remaining schools that I emailed, they never responded to my email request, and I couldn't find any evidence of a diversity plan on their library websites. And a little bit of a side note, there were a small number of respondents who said they did not have a plan in place, but after being prompted by my initial email request, acknowledged that their library probably needed one, and some even said they would start the process of trying to develop one. So since I finished this project back in early 2016, I found that there are a few more library diversity plans that have been recently written, and that Spec Kit 356 that I mentioned a couple of slides ago lists those plans. So here you can see in descending order of frequency the ACRL standards listed and how often they appeared across the pool of plans that I obtained. So you can see that the most frequently listed standard was organizational dynamics, and the least frequent was research, mentioned in the diversity plans that I looked at. So let's take a bit of a closer look at the top 3 standards that were referenced by the plans. And again, when I say referenced, I don't mean that they were specifically citing the ACRL document, but had conceptual connections to how the standards were defined in the ACRL document. And so I had to do a little bit of interpretation as I looked at each plan and mapping. So organizational dynamics, as I said, was the top, the most frequently defined standard in the results that I found. And according to the ACRL document, the full definition of organizational dynamics is librarians and library staff shall participate in and facilitate the development of organizational dynamics that enable individuals, groups, and organizations to continually develop and exercise cultural competence. So what I have listed here on this slide are some examples from the plans of phrases and sentences that exemplify this idea of organizational dynamics. So as you can see, organizational dynamics covers topics like workplace climate, assessments, and employee engagement. And it makes sense to me that this standard would be manifest in all of the plans that I analyzed. Without a good understanding of an organization's culture and climate, it is very difficult to implement new initiatives or develop new programs, especially if the members of that organization do not feel like they are valued members or if they have to work in hostile conditions. So the second most frequent standard was workforce diversity, which is defined in the ACRL document as librarians and library staff shall support and advocate for recruitment, admissions, hiring, and retention efforts in libraries, library associations, and LIS programs to increase diversity and ensure continued diversity in the profession. So this is one topic that I think a lot of institutions have been concerned about for years now. You know, the continued lack of diverse racial representation among librarians is a real problem. And if you look at, ALA has published the demographics of its membership and of the profession, what data they can gather, and the numbers have not really changed significantly over the last 10 to 15 years. So it's not really surprising to see that, you know, most of the diversity plans I looked at included a focus on recruitment and retention of diverse employees. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Okay. The third most common standard that I saw was professional education and continuous learning, professional development essentially. And ACRL defines this as librarians and library staff shall advocate for and participate in educational and training programs that help advance cultural competence within the profession. So we know that our field is constantly evolving, and we have to keep our skills and our knowledge base fresh and up to date in order to serve our constituents better. Honing our skills and cultural competence is no different from learning new pedagogical techniques for instruction or familiarizing ourselves with new cataloging rules. So it's, again, not a surprise to see that professional education and continuous learning rose to the top in these plans, and there was a particular emphasis on encouraging employees to undergo diversity training and to encourage underrepresented staff to pursue a professional degree, so trying to pursue their graduate degree in library and information science if they did not have one. And I'm going to pause for a second here because I do see a question that I want to clarify about is a diversity plan different from a diversity statement? And for the purposes of this study, it is. I did not look at diversity statements, which typically are one-line statements that might be on a library website along with the library's values. A diversity plan, it's written more like a strategic plan where there's stated goals, outcomes, something to look at that you can assess. So just to clarify, I did not look at diversity statements. I was looking at specifically plans. So I also think it's worth taking a look at the standards that appeared very infrequently across the plans that I analyzed to get us thinking about where we need to be more intentional about areas where we need to be more competent. So language diversity was in the bottom three, and it's defined, as you could probably imagine, as librarians and library staff shall support the preservation and promotion of linguistic diversity and work to foster a climate of inclusion aimed at eliminating discrimination and oppression based on linguistic or other diversities. So it's pretty straightforward, I think, but I was surprised at how little this standard was present in the diversity plans that I looked at because we have more and more library users coming into our libraries who speak primary languages other than English. And so the fact that this need is not being addressed in our diversity plans, I think, is a real issue. And I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so excuse me. So this standard, cultural awareness of self and others, it's defined as librarians and library staff shall develop an understanding of their own personal and cultural values and beliefs as a first step in appreciating the importance of multicultural identities in the lives of the people they work with and serve. So one could make the argument that finding ways to implement all of the other standards listed by ACRL would inevitably lead to greater cultural awareness of oneself and of other people, but I think it's still important to be very explicit in recognizing the importance of starting with self-awareness as a foundation for the other competencies. But I also think that this might be one of the hardest standards to quantify or to assess in any concrete or meaningful way. So I'm not too surprised that it actually did not come up very often in the diversity plans that I looked at. And then finally, the least common standard among the plans that I analyzed is defined as research shall be inclusive and respectful of non-Western thought and traditional knowledge reflecting the value of cultural ways of knowing. So in the ACRL document, this definition is extrapolated to cover actions such as support and encouragement for librarians and library staff to conduct research related to diversity. And in particular, the document talks about ensuring research on topics related to diversity are valued in retention, promotion, and tenure processes for those academic libraries where their librarians may have the ability to earn tenure. So while the MLA does not have a document recommending cultural competencies for health information professionals, at least I couldn't find one, I did find a list of other professional competencies that MLA does list, and one of the performance indicators for competency number 4, leadership and management, does address diversity to a certain extent. And I think there are some interesting phrases here, but I would challenge you all to consider what might be missing from this performance indicator. And as it says here, you know, one of the performance indicators is it integrates multicultural awareness and appreciation of diversity and equality into professional practice. So if it's a performance indicator, how do you measure that? There is some alignment here with the diversity standards laid out by ACRL, especially the standard around cultural awareness of self and others. But I think some of the language here could be reconsidered and maybe reframed. For example, that word appreciation, what does that mean? How do you measure appreciation of diversity and equality in terms of your professional work? So something to consider, even when we have something formal in place, it's always good to look at these critically and question the language that we use. And the rest of the competencies that are put forth by MLA, I would challenge you all to think about how each of these individual competencies might be reconsidered within a social justice framework that's centered around diversity, inclusion, and equity. For example, under competency number 3, instruction and instructional design, how could diversity and inclusion be infused into this? When you develop an instruction session around research skills, do you consider issues like the primary language of your audience, or using scenarios or examples in your sessions that might integrate the cultural norms and experiences of your users, especially if they come from marginalized or underrepresented populations? So these are just some examples of ways to rethink these competencies in order to better empower your diverse users and patrons. And I would suggest consider looking at the ACRL document alongside the MLA competencies and map those areas where there could be some alignment as a foundation for developing more inclusive policy and practice. So exploring the impact of a document like the ACRL standards is one way of looking at how we talk about diversity at our libraries. However, outside of the academic library realm, I think we're seeing, especially given the sort of socio-political climate that we're living in, there's an evolving discussion around diversity that's emerging. I think that as a society, our understanding of diversity is evolving, and our conversations about race in particular are starting to borrow from critical theory more and more. So as a profession, in order to move forward with ensuring our libraries are places where everyone has access to whatever information they need, regardless of how they identify or are identified, where the information they need or want to find is not selectively available because of the biases of those who make collection decisions, where libraries are active change agents for undoing oppressive structures and are champions of social justice, all of these actions require not only thinking differently about diversity, but using the right language to talk about it. So this word cloud that I put up on the screen, it represents words that I think are integral to our conversations about diversity. And the size I used to show how often they did or did not appear in the diversity plans that I looked at. So the word inclusion is really big because it was actually used a lot throughout the plans, 64 times across 17 of the plans to be exact. But there were some words that never appeared in any of the plans that I looked at, which is why they're so tiny in this word cloud. Words like racism, anti-racist, whiteness, white privilege, racial justice, words that we're hearing in the conversations that we're having in our social interactions, conversations in media. So these are things that did not appear in the plans at all that I was looking at. So consider the implication of the absence of those words in diversity planning and how our inability to articulate these issues in our formal documents might reflect our difficulties in overcoming the lack of diversity in our actual field. So to shift our thinking around diversity, I'd like us to consider a specific theoretical framework that emerged out of legal scholarship and has been widely adapted by other disciplines, particularly higher education. One framework that I would like us to consider in particular is critical race theory. There's a great article from higher ed literature that defines 5 key elements of critical race theory and how it informs the perspectives, research methods, and pedagogy of scholars who work in this area. So I'm going to take these elements and map their definitions from the field of educational research to our discipline of library and information science. So the first point up there, centrality and intersectionality of race and racism. It's stating that critical race theory is operating from the foundational premise that race and racism are endemic, enduring, and a central, not a marginal factor in explaining differences among individual experiences within libraries. In higher ed, they would say individual experiences within college classroom or the college environment, But for our purposes, let's think about that in libraries. The second point, the challenge to dominant ideology, it's defining critical race theory as challenging traditional notions of the educational system and its institutions, which have typically proclaimed objectivity, meritocracy, color and gender blindness, race and gender neutrality, and equal opportunity. That might sound familiar to us in the field of librarianship. In particular, much like higher education, in librarianship we often talk about neutrality as our desired standpoint. But critical race theory scholars and theorists would push back against those dominant ideas and would argue that upholding such claims of objectivity and neutrality actually camouflage self-interest, power, and privilege for dominant groups. The third point, commitment to social justice, basically is saying that for us, that would mean that by working towards social justice in librarianship, we are working towards the elimination of racism as part of a broader social justice goal that seeks the ending of other types of oppressions that are focused on subordinating groups based on intersecting social identities. The fourth point, centrality of experiential knowledge, it refers to the critical value that the lived experiences or experiential knowledge of men and women of color are legitimate and essential to understanding and analyzing racism within librarianship. Qualitative research methods such as ethnographies, phenomenologies, storytelling, etc., these are essential and integral to informing our understanding of racism within the field. And then finally, interdisciplinary perspective. It emphasizes the importance in critical race theory work of analyzing race and racism by placing these in historical and contemporary contexts using interdisciplinary approaches. Race and racism cannot be analyzed separately from other social identities, nor can race and racism be analyzed independently from socio-historical contexts. So we need to start pushing our research and our writing about race and librarianship to include information, perspectives, and context from other disciplines such as sociology, Black studies, gender studies, history, and education, just to name a few. So why do we need to think about diversity critically? I think using a critical framework, specifically critical race theory, means that we acknowledge and affirm that we as individuals, as libraries, as colleges and universities, as medical or health institutions, we are not separate from the larger political, economic, social, and cultural forces at work in our everyday lives. Furthermore, as we interact with each other and with the larger communities or institutions of which we are a part, we both shape and are shaped by these forces. Sometimes we disrupt them, but often we reaffirm them, and usually unknowingly. So in thinking about diversity in this way, it's important to also consider social identity and social power and how those intersect. So when we talk broadly about social identity groups, we often think of group membership as defined by certain labels, terms that we use to create a laundry list of difference, which is how we have typically defined diversity. Earlier when I asked you to define diversity, I think some of you did mention like categories or labels that we use: age, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, for example. So while recognizing or identifying these broad identities is necessary in order to increase diversity, it's also crucial to situate those identities within specific power dynamics. So I think it's helpful to have a common vocabulary to discuss these concepts, and the University of Michigan has provided some useful definitions for concepts that connect to social identity and power. So when we talk broadly about social identity groups, as I mentioned, we have to situate those groups within power dynamics. It's also important to understand that each of us as individuals either identifies as or is identified by others as having membership within many social identity groups. So depending upon the context where we find ourselves, one or a couple of our identities might be more or less prominent at any given time. And of course, these are connected to the idea of privilege, which I would define as the unearned benefits enjoyed by a particular group based on a particular social identity. What's also important to consider is that because we each hold intersecting identities, there are times when each of us as individuals might have more or less power. So for example, I am currently and grew up as middle to upper middle class in terms of my socioeconomic status. That means that I had and I continue to have more socioeconomic power than someone who might have grown up with a lower income status. That class privilege has led me to having access to high-quality K-12 education and the ability to earn undergraduate and graduate degrees. However, I am also a woman of color who is the daughter of immigrants, and I have experienced marginalization and discrimination around my identities as both a woman and person of color, which in our society are often identities that experience more oppression. So again, considering this concept of power, individuals or groups of people can experience oppression around one or several of their social identities, and oppression can occur on multiple levels as well. One can experience an individual act of oppression, like a microaggression that might occur during a one-on-one personal interaction. Examples of an institutional or systemic oppression, which is, like, I would say, a level up, can occur when policies or practices disadvantage whole groups of people. So, for example, inequitable funding models for schools, which disproportionately disadvantage communities of color. And social and cultural oppression can occur both alongside and around institutional oppression and can be another form of systemic oppression. Think of social norms, customs, or assumptions that can marginalize, silence, or even erase the identities of those who don't hold power. For example, think of the continuing lack of racially diverse representation in leading roles for television and mainstream films, and how that might perpetuate the invisibility of people of color in our culture or reinforce stereotypes if representation is very limited. So let's examine why using a critical race lens is important when thinking about diversity and inclusion. So this cartoon, I think some of you may have seen this or similar versions of it online. While I do think we have made some progress in thinking about diversity, where we are moving from an equality mindset, which states that we treat everybody equally regardless of their differences, and moving towards an equity mindset, where we're trying to achieve the same outcomes for everyone regardless of their differences, and that we do that by providing interventions that get to those outcomes. And in this picture, you can see there are baseball fans standing on boxes. Those would be the interventions that I mentioned. But I think that we can push our thinking around this even further. So using a critical lens to examine issues around diversity means moving from an equity mindset to a social justice mindset. And here you can see we've got panels, again, with the fans watching a baseball game. We can see the same intervention, boxes of equal size, are provided to each fan to boost them up higher so they can see the game, and that's the first third of this image. However, as you can see, this intervention doesn't result in an equal outcome, as the shortest person among the group is still not able to see over the barrier. In the middle image, and this is the conceptual space where I think most of us in our organizations are currently occupying, different interventions are being provided to each fan, so the shortest fan gets more boxes, to give each of them an equal view of the baseball game. So if we want to think of this in terms of higher education, for example, this might mean providing scholarships to students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to give them access to the same college or university as those students who come from a higher socioeconomic status. But despite the equity of the outcome, where the fans can all see or the students can all pay to get into school, the barrier itself remains intact. So in the last panel, we see a shift from the equity mindset to a social justice mindset. The barrier is completely eliminated for all of the fans. And that, I think, is the hardest work for us to do, overcoming and eliminating those structural and systemic barriers that we may have in place to access for our many users that we serve. So achieving that level of liberation, it's more complex. This is a very simplistic cartoon, but I think this is a good, quick way to imagine how we can transform our thinking and explain this to those around us as well. So to revisit the ACRL diversity standards for a moment, now that we've considered critical race theory as a framework and have seen how we might move our thinking around diversity to an action-oriented social justice mindset, I think there's value in examining and even implementing many of the ACRL standards, but I want us to consider where they or even the MLA competencies may fall short. The ACRL standards are very focused on individual personal development and training, and to some extent development or training at a library level, but there's very little there to consider about how to create change or transformation at the institutional level, nor do the standards ask us to consider how larger socio-historical and political forces constrain us. I think that there is this underlying assumption that if we change our interpersonal behaviors, then we might be able to make some kind of impact outward. But the truth of it is, and this is what makes anti-oppression work so challenging, is that we have to be working at all levels simultaneously to push for change. So it's not enough for me to just think that if I improve my competencies around have a better cultural understanding of people who are different from me, and that informs my personal interactions, that's enough, that's going to make change more broadly. We have to tackle all of these things at the same time, and that is really hard work, but it's something that we have to keep in mind. So given this new framework to consider how we look at diversity in our libraries, where do we go from here? I want to set before you some possible counter-narratives to the dominant discourses that we've had in libraries for a long time. And there are other dominant narratives than what I'm going to show you that you could think about pushing back against. So the first one, this idea that libraries are neutral spaces, and librarians and other informational professionals should strive to be neutral in their work. There's been a lot of debate over whether or not neutrality at this point is a core value of librarianship and libraries in general. And I think for a long time we've been told as information professionals that we should be as transparent as possible in the work that we do. But the truth of the matter is that we each bring our own mix of intersecting social identities into the spaces we inhabit, both professionally and personally. And our institutions are also the result of sociopolitical and historical forces that have shaped the ways in which we collect, preserve, and disseminate information. So if we aren't willing to look critically then at ourselves, our practices, and the institutions in which we work, aren't we just maintaining the status quo, which has proven to be oppressive for many people over generations? So let's start to think about ways that we can disrupt this particular narrative. What can we do to push back against neutrality as an ideal, and what can we put forth instead as an ideal that we should be striving for professionally? Another issue is around collections. So this idea that we just need to provide more diverse library collections that reflect diverse identities and perspectives, and that's good enough for diversity work. And many of us recognize that our library collections often reflect a very Eurocentric perspective. I think we believe with the best of intentions that if we add more quote unquote diverse books into our collections, that we will address a large part of our lack of diversity. But a counter-narrative that I would like to propose is that simply adding a handful of titles from marginalized perspectives is not truly transformative. If you build it, they will come is not always an effective approach in academic libraries. And as we know from our circulation statistics, many of us have print collections in particular where the majority of titles have never been touched. So just adding more diverse collections does not ensure that they'll be used in the classroom or that faculty or researchers will use them as part of their research activities. And to what extent do our collection practices and the scholarly publication industry make it more difficult for marginalized perspectives to get wide dissemination? So what are some ways that we can start to think critically about our collection management policies and practices that push back against even more marginalization? Thinking about sort of how a lot of scholarly publishing now is so much more corporate involvement, and how that might impact who gets to publish, what publications are seen as legitimate, where certain voices may get pushed to the edges and continue to be pushed to the edges, and our users don't even know that research around certain topics might exist. So how can we push back against that sort of corporate model of collections that's happening right now? Another dominant narrative that I think we have is that, we assume that if we simply increase our demographic diversity, our quote-unquote diversity problems will be fixed. But I think there are a couple of issues with this kind of thinking. First, it keeps us in a mindset that diversity is a problem that can be solved, which I think creates some sort of negative subconscious associations with the word diversity. It can lead to tokenism, or the idea that someone is hired for a position or given a scholarship simply because of their racial or ethnic identity, and not because they are otherwise qualified or can bring other skills and talents to an organization. Furthermore, increasing diversity in terms of numbers does nothing to change the structures around diversity. If we just bring in people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds without paying any attention to the environment in which we bring them, we are signaling a couple of things. The first thing we're saying is that persons of color are expected to adapt or assimilate into the existing culture, which could be hostile. So it's no surprise when retention issues arise. And second, having demographic diversity on the surface also makes it easier for us to ignore the deeper reasons why we were never diverse in the first place, which means doing the hard work of looking at our policies and practices through a critical lens. So again, I would like us to think about, what are some ways that we can think differently about our strategies for increasing diversity that's meaningful? What other narratives around hiring for diversity could we disrupt? What are our expectations on how we've always done things when it comes to the interview process? What are some things that we're doing in that might make it easier for our unconscious biases to come forward and impact or affect who we might bring into an organization? So naming these things and bringing them to the surface is really important if we want to change them, and change them in a way that's lasting. So these are some questions for you to just sort of take back with you to consider moving forward, and that I hope you have critical conversations with your colleagues around these issues to think about what you can start to do on an individual basis, at a library level, and also at the wider institutional level to try to move where we are in libraries to a more socially just place. There are a lot of great articles out there now, a lot of research that's being done, a lot of great writing that's being done that explore ideas of critical librarianship, and they look at librarianship not just through a race lens, but also through a critical queer lens, a feminist lens, and other modes of inquiry that use intersectional approaches. So what I have here on the slide, and I'm hoping that the slides will get shared with everybody after this, these are just a few that I highly recommend reading. And I also, as I said before, finding new places where things get published to find information. Don't just limit yourself to research articles. There are some other online spaces where there are really great conversations happening around these issues, blogs, Twitter, et cetera, where librarians are engaging in conversations to move us towards a more socially just future. So at this point, I'm going to stop and thank you again for listening to me and taking the time out of your day to share with me. So I'm happy to take questions.
I see a question about will we be able to access the slides later, and I spoke with Ione earlier, and she did give me permission to go ahead and email you guys a PDF of her presentation. I will do that along with a link to the recording on YouTube as soon as it's available. So if you did pre-register for the webinar, I have your email address and will be able to send that out to you. If you did not pre-register, please feel free to email me directly later, and I'll be sure to add you to a list so that you receive the slides as well as the recording too. If you have any other questions, please feel free to put that into the chat box as well. And I'll give you guys a few minutes to think about any potential questions you may have.
And again, I shared a lot of information, with everybody. So if you think of something after the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to continue the conversation there as well. But yeah, if there are any questions that came up, I would be happy to try to answer.
So I see one that asks if you can name some blogs in which we could learn more.
Yeah, so one is the Feral Librarian, F-E-R-A-L Librarian. It's the blog for Chris Berg. I'm not sure I'm saying her name right. It's B-O-U-R-G, the director of the MIT Libraries. She writes a lot about social justice issues. There's another blog. It's April Hathcock. Her last name is spelled H-A-T-H-C-O-C-K. I believe it's At the Intersections is the name of her blog. But I think if you just Google her, you'll find her. She's written a lot about the intersections of feminism and race. She's actually a scholarly communications librarian, I believe, at NYU. She's fantastic. She's written a lot. So those are just a couple off the top of my head. And then on Twitter, actually, there's there are regular. I'll have to admit, I am not really good about using Twitter, but if you look up hashtag CritLib, CRITLIB, there are a lot of great conversations around critical ideas, critical issues in libraries that touch on these issues that use that hashtag. And I think they have specific times for structured topics, conversations on Twitter pretty regularly. So if you look up hashtag CritLib, that's another great way to find out more about what people are talking about in this area.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? So Michelle says, great information, and I appreciate the way you framed the conversation. We've begun working with our campus diversity officer. In regards to collection management, are there some info you can share about approaching the weeding and building of the collection through an equity lens?
So at my library right now, we're actually in the process of doing a massive weeding project. And unfortunately, we're kind of, full disclosure, we don't have a diversity plan. We have a diversity committee that's a volunteer committee, kind of limited in our scope. I'm trying to work with our diversity committee to propose us becoming a more formalized team so that we can have more impact on all aspects of what's going on in the libraries to help our liaison librarians, our collection management librarians, for example, have a better understanding of how to start to look at their work through this lens. But one resource that I would point you to, and it is listed in the citations that I have for additional recommended reading. Again, MIT is very forward-thinking, and they issued a white paper. It's a report called Creating a Social Justice Mindset on how they think diversity, inclusion, and social justice should inform their work in collections. And they have some great foundational information about neoliberalism, corporatization of academic libraries, commercialization of scholarly publishing, and how that impacts what we can get. And so if we rely too much on like package deals, for example, you know, those packages, they're connected to specific corporate interests, right, in publishing, and not necessarily making spaces for more marginalized research perspectives to take place. So, you know, accounting for open access publications, how do we push those to the forefront, for example, where some of this work is being done, instead of listing, you know, the big packages that we pay for as the first things listed on our resources page or our LibGuides, for example. So that's just one thing to consider. But yeah, you'll see it's the first citation here on the additional recommended reading. Thankfully, they put their report in their institutional repository, again, thinking about open access, so that anybody can read it and get ideas on how to infuse these ideas into their work.
And then the next question I see from Carla asks, how do we effectively assess improvement?
So that's a really good question. We have on our campus created within the last year and a half a new office for diversity and inclusion, and a couple of hires in that office, a VP for the office, and then an executive director for inclusive education and professional development. And they're getting ready to launch a big campus-wide assessment of the diversity activities and initiatives that have taken place over the last, I think, 10 years or so. You know, I think it's not enough to just look at numbers when we think about how do we assess diversity. It's the harder stuff, you know, so doing things like qualitative research with our users, focus groups, doing outreach, maybe if you're on a campus, for example, like working more closely with your Office of Multicultural Affairs to find out what do the students who are typically served by that office, how do they view the libraries? what do they think is missing from their experience when they come here? And how can we use that kind of qualitative sort of lived experience information to inform the things that we're doing? You know, assessment is really challenging, and I admit I'm not an assessment librarian, but I think there are people who are starting to figure out, you know, how do we do this work? But I think the qualitative information is almost more important at this point than the quantitative. Numbers don't always tell the story, right? So that's just one thing that I would put out there.
So the next question from Goodman says, have you begun to think about systematic ways in which research librarians or libraries might have meaningful change?
Again, so I think, you know, examining what your policies and your practices are and what you do and how you do it, how you do research services or reference services, the ways that you deliver that, who are you not reaching? Who's missing from that, from those interactions? Are you looking at universal design and accessibility when you are designing your research and reference spaces? You know, we're going through a renovation, which is driving our collection weeding and all of this stuff. And so we're trying to think about, you know, all of the different ways that we can serve differently abled patrons in our spaces. The kinds of research that we do ourselves, that we research and write about and publish, you know, what is the lens that we use to inform what we're researching? So if I'm doing, let's say I'm doing a research project on something that I'm doing with instruction, how might I use a critical lens to look at the results of my study? You know, looking at the demographics of, if I'm looking at a particular instruction session, you know, how are the demographics of that session laid out? What am I noticing that might be different for different people in that experience? You know, am I just looking at numbers? Am I looking at, again, qualitative experiences? Am I doing focus groups? That kind of work. I think there are a lot of different areas where we could certainly expand our lens and think more critically about what we do.
Okay. I was asked privately if I could email the reading list, and this slide, along with the entire PowerPoint, will be emailed to all participants. Once again, Yesenia, I apologize if I misspoke your name, wanted to know if you, Ione, would be open to us contacting you directly.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, please do.
So I'm going to go ahead and include your email address in the chat box. It will also be included in the PowerPoint as well. And then the last question I think we have time for is from Carla. Is there a national conference on diversity which brings together all sectors that can impact the issues you have outlined?
Actually, I would encourage people to think not just library conferences, but other conferences as well that have a focus. But actually, coming up later this year in September, the Joint Conference for Librarians of Color is going to take place. I believe this is the third time it's happened. It's not an annual. It's a little bit irregular. It's sponsored by the Joint Ethnic Caucuses of the American Library Association. So if you look up JCLC 2018, it's going to take place in Albuquerque this year. So that's one that I would encourage. Other ones in higher ed that I'm familiar with, NCORE, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, that happens every year. I attended that with a group of people from my university way back in 2006, I think it was. And so that's looking more broadly at higher ed, but there were a lot of intersections, you know, where we could do a better job of working with our campus partners around these issues. So NCORE, N-C-O-R-E, is another one that I would recommend. One that I've heard colleagues talk about on campus that I have not yet had the opportunity to attend is the White Privilege Conference, and I believe that happens annually as well. So you could look that up online. And then finally, the National Diversity in Libraries Conference is another irregular conference that occurs. They had one, let's see, 2016 I think was the last one. But I would, again, Google that, NDLC, to see when they might be getting ready for the next call for proposals and what might be out there. And then, of course, you know, now I'm seeing more and more sessions, workshops coming out around these issues, being sponsored by lots of different library organizations. So just keep an eye out with MLA, ALA, all of its subdivisions. There's a lot of stuff happening.
And I see that Shannon and Stephen have posted links to some of those conferences that you had mentioned as well. So thanks, Stephen and Shannon, for doing that. Okay. So thank you again, Ione, for the presentation. I really, really appreciated that. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded, and we will post this on the NNLM YouTube channel as soon as possible. If you would like, I would recommend subscribing to our YouTube channel so that you'll be able to access when things are posted and available from all of our offices as well. I will try and send out, once it is posted on YouTube, Ione's slides as well as the recording link for you so that you can access that. For evaluating today's webinar, I would like it if you would be able to take a moment to evaluate today's webinar. At the end of completing the evaluation, you will receive a MLA code that you can enter into the MedLibEd website, and there will be instructions on how to receive credit for attending today's webinar. I did go ahead and post that in the chat box for you as well. And then finally, one thing I want to say is that the Southeastern Atlantic region has a few upcoming webinars that you may be interested in. On March 16th, we have Carrie Price, who is a clinical informationist at the Welch Medical Library, who will talk about predatory publishing and discuss how she has worked with residents and hospital faculty to help them become aware of predatory publishing there. On April 5th, we have Dr. Scott Nass, Director of Inpatient Education and Family Medicine Residency Program at the Citrus Valley Partners and David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He will discuss transgender health. And finally, on April 19th, we have Eileen Harrington, Health and Life Sciences Librarian at the University of Maryland, Shady Grove, who will talk about citizen science. More details on these will be posted on the NNLM SEA blog as soon as details are available. Thank you again for attending today's webinar, and Ione, I want to thank you so much for sharing all that you have done research-wise and getting all of us to think more about diversity within medical and health sciences librarianship. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.